Frankfurt, 1818. Arthur Schopenhauer hunched over his desk, the candlelight casting long shadows across his manuscript. At 40 years old, his receding hairline and permanent scowl made him appear much older. He dipped his pen and continued, writing what would become his magnum opus, The World as Will and Representation. The philosopher paused, listening to feminine laughter drifting up from the street below. His mouth tightened with displeasure. Women, with their frivolous concerns and superficial chatter, represented everything he despised about society. Or so he told himself. What few knew was how deeply Arthur's relationship with his mother had shaped these views. Johanna Schopenhauer had abandoned him emotionally after his father's suicide, choosing her literary salon over maternal duties. This wound festered within him, transmuting into philosophical contempt for an entire gender. They exist solely for the propagation of the species, he muttered, writing the words that would later scandalize and divide intellectual circles across Europe. Little did Arthur know that across town, a young woman was about to enter his life who would challenge everything he thought he knew about the female intellect. Karoline Weber sat in her father's study, forbidden books stacked beside her. At 23, she possessed a fierce intelligence that had no proper outlet in 1818 Germany. Her father, a progressive professor at the university, secretly educated her despite society's disapproval. Kant is merely the beginning, Professor Weber said, handing her a worn copy of a philosophical text. But I must warn you about this new work by Schopenhauer. His views on women are, he hesitated, problematic to say the least. Caroline's eyes flashed with determination. Then his arguments must be particularly weak in that area. Later that evening, at a gathering of intellectuals hosted by her father, Karoline overheard heated discussions about Schopenhauer's latest philosophical assertions. He believes women are incapable of objective reasoning, one man declared, that our intellectual superiority is nature's design. Karoline approached, teacup in hand. And what evidence does he provide for this claim? The men turned, startled, by her intrusion into their intellectual domain. Evidence? One laughed. It is observable reality, Fräulein Weber. Observable through what methodology? She pressed. Personal anecdote? Limited social interactions? The systematic exclusion of women from education that might disprove his hypothesis? Her father watched nervously from across the room as silence fell over the gathering. The Frankfurt bookshop was Schopenhauer's sanctuary. He browsed the philosophy section in solitude, avoiding the social pleasantries he found so tiresome. "Excuse me," came a feminine voice behind him. "Could you perhaps reach that volume for me? The Kant." Arthur turned with obvious irritation, expecting to find a frivolous young woman seeking a fashionable prop. Instead, he met the direct gaze of Karoline Weber. "You read Kant?" he asked skeptically, handing her the book. "I not only read him, Herr Schopenhauer, but I find his categorical imperative lacks sufficient consideration of emotional intelligence." She paused, watching recognition dawn on his face. "Yes, I know who you are. Your work on will and representation presents fascinating perspectives, though I must strongly disagree with your assessment of female intellectual capacity." Arthur was speechless, something his colleagues would have deemed impossible. "Perhaps," Karoline continued, "your observations reflect not women's inherent limitations, but rather the systematic constraints society places upon them." Before he could formulate a suitably cutting response, she had paid for her book and departed, leaving Arthur with the unsettling feeling that his carefully constructed worldview had just been challenged by its very subject. News of Karoline's confrontation with Schopenhauer spread through Frankfurt's intellectual circles. Professor Weber received concerned visitors warning that his daughter's behavior would damage both their reputations. She directly challenged Schopenhauer in public, his colleague hissed. "It's unseemly." "Perhaps," Professor Weber replied, "but was she wrong?" Meanwhile, Arthur couldn't shake the encounter from his mind. He found himself revising passages of his manuscript, anticipating Karoline's potential counter-arguments. This imaginary intellectual duel frustrated him immensely. When he received an invitation to Professor Weber's philosophical salon, Arthur initially tossed it aside. Yet curiosity, and a desire to definitively put this impertinent young woman in her place led him to attend. The salon buzzed with conversation when Arthur entered. He immediately spotted Karoline engaged in animated discussion with two university professors. Schopenhauer argues that women exist primarily for reproduction, one professor was saying as Arthur approached. How do you respond to that, Fräulein Weber? I would ask why Herr Schopenhauer himself exists then, she replied, unaware of Arthur's presence. If not for reproduction, as he remains unmarried with no children, then perhaps for intellectual contribution. And if that purpose suffices for him, why not for women as well? Because women lack the capacity for objective reasoning, Arthur interrupted, making his presence known. All eyes turned to him as Karoline smiled. Herr Schopenhauer, how fortunate. Now you can explain what empirical evidence supports your assertion. What began as a brief exchange evolved into hours of philosophical debate that left the salon attendees captivated, and Arthur Schopenhauer unsettled by Karoline's intellectual prowess. Arthur returned to his solitary apartment after the salon, his mind racing. He had constructed elaborate arguments about women's intellectual inferiority, yet Karoline Weber had matched him point for point. It was an anomaly, he decided, a single exception that proved the rule. The following morning, a letter arrived from Karoline, continuing their debate with references to texts and logical frameworks. Arthur found himself eagerly drafting a response, launching an unexpected correspondence that would continue for months. You misunderstand my fundamental argument, he wrote. Women's minds are suited to immediate practical concerns, while men's are designed for abstract reasoning. Karoline's reply came swiftly. Yet history shows that when women are permitted education, they excel in abstract domains. Is it not more logical that observed differences stem from opportunity rather than inherent capacity? With each exchange, Arthur found himself refining his positions, sometimes unconsciously moderating them. The intellectual stimulation was undeniable, though he would admit this to no one. Their correspondence remained private until Arthur referred to it during a lecture, using one of Karoline's arguments without attribution. Word reached her quickly. You quoted my reasoning as an interesting counter-argument, she wrote. If my thinking has merit, what does that suggest about your broader claims regarding female intellect? Arthur crumpled the letter, yet couldn't bring himself to discard it. While visiting Professor Weber's home to continue a debate from their previous letter, Arthur noticed something unusual in the study, a stack of manuscripts in feminine handwriting. What are these? He asked, picking up the top pages. Professor Weber hesitated. Philosophical essays, anonymous publications in various journals. Arthur scanned the text, recognizing the style immediately. These are Karoline's. Yes, the professor admitted. Published under male pseudonyms, her work on ethics has been cited by professors at 3 universities, none aware of the author's gender. Arthur's hand trembled slightly as he replaced the manuscript. His world was built on certainties, on the comforting philosophical framework that ordered existence into comprehensible patterns. Karoline's work threatened to unravel a significant thread. Why show me this? Arthur demanded. Because you're beginning to question your assumptions, Professor Weber replied. And because my daughter respects your intellect, despite your dismissal of hers. Later that evening, Arthur found Karoline in the garden. You've been publishing under false names, he stated. Would the ideas be considered fairly otherwise? She challenged. For once, Arthur had no immediate response. The announcement appeared in Frankfurt's intellectual circles and quickly became the talk of the city. Arthur Schopenhauer would debate philosophical concepts with an anonymous opponent at the University Hall. On the appointed evening, the hall was packed with curious spectators, professors, students, and society figures. When Karoline walked onto the stage as the anonymous opponent, gasps and murmurs rippled through the audience. This is inappropriate, one professor declared loudly. Perhaps we should hear the arguments before judging, came a female voice from the crowd. The debate began tensely, with Arthur presenting his views on aesthetics with his customary confidence. When Karoline rose to respond, many expected embarrassment or sentiment. Instead, she delivered a systematic deconstruction of his arguments, presenting alternative frameworks with rigorous logic. Arthur found himself engaged in the most stimulating public debate of his career. When Karoline referenced his own previous works to highlight inconsistencies in his current position, a begrudging respect flickered across his face. As the evening progressed, the audience's initial skepticism transformed. They were witnessing, not a spectacle but a genuine intellectual exchange. When the debate concluded, the applause was thunderous. "You have given me much to consider," Arthur admitted privately as they left the stage. "As have you," Karoline replied. "Intellectual growth requires challenge, does it not?" The Frankfurt newspaper's headline was provocative. "Woman debates philosopher. Curiosity or catastrophe?" The public debate between Schopenhauer and Karoline Weber became a flashpoint for broader discussions about women's education and intellectual capacity. At dinner parties and social gatherings, opinions divided sharply. "It undermines the natural order," declared Frau Schmidt, wife of a prominent banker. "Women who pursue such interests neglect their proper duties." Yet Fräulein Weber manages her household responsibilities admirably, countered another woman. "Perhaps the natural order is not as restrictive as we've been led to believe." For Karoline, the aftermath brought both opportunity and difficulty. Several young women sought her guidance on philosophical texts, forming an informal study circle. Simultaneously, she received anonymous letters condemning her unfeminine behavior. Arthur himself faced ridicule from colleagues who couldn't forgive his serious engagement with a female intellect. Some dismissed the entire debate as a publicity stunt. "Have you reconsidered your positions on female intelligence?" one particularly smug professor asked at a faculty gathering. "I have reconsidered the evidence," Arthur replied carefully. "One must adjust one's thinking when presented with contradictory data." The professor laughed. "Surely one anomalous woman doesn't invalidate natural law." "Perhaps," Arthur said, "what we've attributed to natural law is merely convenient social convention." Arthur's publisher was explicitly clear. "These revisions to your chapters on gender weaken your overall argument. Readers expect your characteristic definitiveness, not these new qualifications." 6 months of correspondence and debate with Karoline had indeed affected Arthur's manuscript. He had quietly modified his most extreme positions on female intellectual capacity, introducing nuance where once there had been absolute certainty. "The public wants conviction, not contemplation," the publisher continued. "Restore the original text, or we must reconsider our arrangement." That evening, Arthur paced his apartment, manuscript pages scattered across his desk. His reputation was built on uncompromising perspectives. Would introducing doubt undermine his philosophical authority? Yet intellectual honesty demanded acknowledgement of contradictory evidence. Meanwhile, Karoline faced her own crisis. Her father had fallen ill, and financial pressures mounted. A marriage proposal from a wealthy merchant offered security, but would end her intellectual pursuits. "He's made it clear that philosophical debates would not be permitted," she told Arthur during their weekly meeting at the bookshop. "He calls my interests a temporary eccentricity." Arthur surprised himself with his immediate response. That would be an unconscionable waste of a formidable mind. Their eyes met in shared understanding of the constraints society placed on them both, albeit in very different ways. Arthur stood before his publisher's desk, revised manuscript in hand. "I cannot restore the original text," he stated firmly. "Intellectual integrity requires acknowledging evidence that challenges one's positions. This will damage your reputation," the publisher warned. "Perhaps," Arthur conceded. "Or perhaps, it will demonstrate philosophical rigor," the publisher sighed. "We'll proceed, but I maintain this softening of your position on women's intellect will be seen as weakness." Arthur left the office with mixed emotions. For the first time in his career, he had chosen intellectual honesty over the certainty that had defined his philosophical identity. Meanwhile, Karoline made her own difficult decision. She declined the merchant's proposal and instead accepted a position as governess to a progressive family in Berlin who supported her continued writing. Before her departure, she met Arthur one last time in Professor Weber's study. "I've read your revised manuscript," she said. "The modifications regarding female capacities, they represent significant reconsideration." "Evidence demanded it," he replied stiffly. Karoline smiled. "That is the highest compliment you could offer. Treating my arguments as evidence, rather than exception." Arthur handed her a letter of introduction to philosophical circles in Berlin. "Your mind deserves challenging opponents." It was as close to friendship as Arthur Schopenhauer had ever come. Berlin, 1820. Karoline's position as governess allowed her evenings for intellectual pursuits. Through Arthur's reluctant letter of introduction, she gained access to philosophical salons previously closed to women. "Your debates with Schopenhauer are notorious," one philosopher told her. "He was never known to modify his positions before you." Meanwhile, Arthur's revised work met mixed reception. Some critics accused him of compromising his philosophical integrity. Others praised his intellectual evolution. Through it all, Arthur and Karoline maintained their correspondence, now focused less on gender and more on metaphysics and ethics. "Your latest essay on compassion contains an interesting contradiction," Karoline wrote. "You argue it stems from recognition of shared suffering, yet elsewhere claim women's suffering is fundamentally different from men's." Arthur's reply came after a longer delay than usual. "Perhaps all human suffering shares more commonality than I previously acknowledged." In Berlin, Karoline faced her own contradictions. The intellectual stimulation was tremendous, but she increasingly questioned whether theoretical philosophy addressed the practical challenges women faced. She began visiting workhouses and schools for poor girls, witnessing firsthand how philosophical abstractions failed to improve concrete conditions. Her letters to Arthur shifted, challenging him to consider philosophy's purpose beyond intellectual exercise. "What value has your understanding of will if it doesn't alleviate suffering?" she wrote. "Is philosophy merely men talking to other men about ideas that never touch the world?" Arthur had no immediate answer. Arthur's public lecture was supposed to focus on aesthetics. Instead, to his audience's surprise, he addressed the relationship between philosophical thought and social reality. "Philosophy that retreats from lived experience becomes mere intellectual gymnastics," he declared, echoing Karoline's recent criticism without attribution. "The suffering of those deemed intellectually inferior, women, the poor, challenges our comfortable abstractions." The audience shifted uncomfortably. This was not the Schopenhauer they expected. In Berlin, Karoline's path also took an unexpected turn. After publishing an anonymous essay connecting metaphysical concepts of will to women's lack of legal autonomy, she was invited to contribute regularly to a progressive journal under her real name. "This is unprecedented," her friend Clara warned. "The backlash will be severe." "Perhaps," Karoline agreed, "but continuing to hide reinforces the very prejudices we challenge." Her first signed article argued that philosophical discussions of human nature were fatally flawed when excluding half of humanity from both the conversation and the concept. When the journal reached Arthur, he spent an entire evening composing a response, only to discard it. Instead, he wrote a brief note. "Your courage exceeds mine. The argument is sound, though the world is not ready." Yet privately, he began drafting what would become his most controversial work, an examination of how philosophical traditions had systematically excluded perspectives that might challenge their foundations. Frankfurt, 1821. Arthur was surprised to receive a visit from Clara Wieck, Karoline's friend from Berlin. She brought disturbing news. Karoline's latest work has created powerful enemies, Clara explained. A prominent professor has published a vicious attack questioning not just her ideas, but her moral character. Arthur read the article with growing anger. The professor had ignored Karoline's philosophical arguments entirely, instead suggesting that women who engaged in such pursuits were unnatural and likely morally corrupt in private affairs. "This is intellectual dishonesty of the highest order," Arthur declared. "Why come to me? Because despite your differences, you've always engaged with her ideas honestly, Clara said. A public response from you would carry significant weight. Arthur hesitated. Defending Karoline would align him with radical ideas about women's education and rights, positions that could further marginalize him from mainstream philosophical circles. I will consider it, he said finally. After Clara left, Arthur paced his study for hours. His relationship with Karoline had evolved from antagonistic to respectful, but publicly aligning with her cause would have profound professional consequences. Yet the professor's attack represented everything Arthur had come to recognize as intellectually dishonest, using power and position to silence challenging voices rather than engaging with their arguments. The next morning, Arthur began writing what would become his most controversial essay, yet, on intellectual integrity and the fear of female thought. The philosophical journal arrived with Arthur's essay prominently featured. In it, he methodically dismantled the professor's attack on Karoline, exposing its logical fallacies and underlying fears. When we attack the messenger rather than address the message, Arthur wrote, we reveal not strength but insecurity in our own positions. The history of philosophy shows that our greatest advances came when we confronted, rather than silenced, challenging perspectives. Most surprisingly, Arthur directly acknowledged how his own views had evolved. I once proclaimed with certainty women's intellectual limitations. Experience and evidence have forced reconsideration, the mark not of weakness but of genuine, philosophical inquiry. The essay caused immediate uproar. Arthur received letters of both support and condemnation from colleagues. Several withdrew invitations to speak at their institutions. In Berlin, Karoline read the essay with complex emotions. Arthur's defense was powerful precisely because he had once been her most formidable opponent. His evolution lent credibility to arguments that might otherwise be dismissed. She wrote to him, "Your defense risked much professionally. Why take such a step?" Arthur's reply was uncharacteristically personal. Because intellectual honesty demanded it, and perhaps because I have come to value our correspondence more than the approval of those who fear what they do not understand. 1825. Arthur's philosophical reputation had changed dramatically. Once known for absolute certainty, he became infamous for his willingness to publicly reconsider positions, something many colleagues viewed as weakness, but younger philosophers increasingly respected. His latest work, Philosophy and Excluded Voices, argued that Western philosophical tradition had systematically ignored perspectives that might challenge its fundamental assumptions. Though controversial, it was being discussed in university circles previously dismissive of such ideas. Meanwhile, Karoline had established a small but influential school in Berlin, where girls received rigorous philosophical education alongside traditional subjects. Though constantly battling financial challenges and social disapproval, the school attracted daughters of progressive families throughout Germany. When Arthur visited Berlin to deliver a lecture series, he accepted Karoline's invitation to speak at her school. Walking into a classroom of young women engaged in philosophical debate was a profound experience for a man who had once declared such scenes intellectually impossible. "You have created something remarkable," he told Karoline afterward. "Something that challenges not just what we think, but how we think." "As have you," she replied. "Your willingness to publicly evolve your thinking has influenced younger philosophers more than you know." Neither could have predicted their unlikely intellectual partnership, nor its gradual influence on German philosophical circles. Frankfurt, 1860. Arthur Schopenhauer, now an old man, sat in his study reviewing correspondence for his collected letters. Among them were 4 decades of exchanges with Karoline Weber, documenting their evolution from intellectual opponents to respectful colleagues. The world had changed since their first contentious meeting. Women's education remained controversial, but was no longer unprecedented. Karoline's school had expanded, and several of her former students now published philosophical works under their own names. Arthur's legacy was complex. His early misogynistic writings were still quoted by those opposing women's advancement, while his later reconsiderations were embraced by progressives as evidence that even the most entrenched views could evolve when confronted with contradictory evidence. As he organized the letters for publication, Arthur included a note. These exchanges represent not merely correspondence, but the essence of philosophical practice, the willingness to engage seriously with perspectives that challenge our most fundamental assumptions. In Berlin, Karoline reviewed her own copy of the correspondence. At 65, she had lived to see changes she once thought impossible, though true equality remained a distant dream. Her greatest pride was not in her published works, but in her students, young women who took for granted their right to philosophical inquiry. She added her own note to the collection. What began as intellectual combat evolved into something more valuable, demonstration that progress comes not when we silence opposing voices, but when we truly hear them. History would remember Schopenhauer primarily for his earlier works, relegating his evolution to footnotes. Yet the ripples of his unlikely intellectual relationship with Karoline Weber would influence generations of philosophers who believed that truth emerged not from comfortable certainty, but from the courage to question one's own convictions.